Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Keldon Bester from the Canadian Anti-Monopoly Project, and there was some piece of news that caught my eye in the last week, which was that the Competition Bureau got some court documents or a court order for documents from Google about their investigations, their ad practices, and Keldon is our competition guy, so I figured I would get him to explain the significance of what all this means. Keldon, Keldon.
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, no, it's an exciting announcement, although it leaves a lot of questions, like so many of these announcements do. The
Mhm.
Competition Bureau has actually been looking into Google's advertising practices since about, as we learned from this announcement, 2020. But what they just announced is an expansion of that investigation to include a broader set of conduct, which I can talk more about. So I
Sure.
think on the one hand, at a high level, this is good news because the investigation is still ongoing. But after 4 years, the question is, how long will an expanded investigation take?
Yeah, and I'm wondering if this expansion has to do with the new powers that they were given with the legislation that passed at the end of last year.
Well, it certainly has something to do with it. In the announcement, there's some language about intending to harm competition. And that actually is from some language that's been added to our laws just before the holidays last year. Before, you could actually intend to harm competition, but be protected by the competition laws through what they call a substantial effects test. But now the law has been broadened to include the intent to harm competition, which suggests that the Bureau is now looking at that lens when it looks at Google's conduct.
Okay. And I guess with your concern about it taking longer, given if they're expanding the reach of the investigation, I'm wondering if possibly they've found breadcrumbs that would lead them to expand this more, or what we think that might look like.
Yeah, that's clearly the case here. It's interesting. You think about um, they've had a court order to request documents from Google's before from that original investigation. We learned about that in 2021. Um, but your point about breadcrumbs seems accurate. They found something beyond the scope of that initial investigation that warrants them going back to a judge to say, hey, we need to take a deeper look here. So again, that's exciting. And one thing about that in particular, Google is under a raft of antitrust investigations around the world.
Hmm.
But some language from the announcement, particularly about predatory pricing. Predatory pricing is an important concept in competition law, but in a place like the US, that it really can't be applied because of adverse judicial decisions. So in Canada, this is a unique aspect where the Competition Bureau may play a complementary role to other global players.
And that's actually kind of what I was thinking about bringing up, because I mean, we kind of get this sense that, we're little Canada. We don't have much of an impact on the global stage and that kind of impact. But do the changes that are happening give us a little more weight in that regard?
Yeah, there's 2 points there. I think the first is, except in certain cases, we really can't rely on international players to solve all our problems for us. If an international investigation reaches a remedy, it won't necessarily apply to Canada. We have to find a violation of our own competition laws. So I think that's something to keep in mind when we think
Yeah.
about international action. But to your point specifically, there's uniqueness in our law. We often think about it in terms of weaknesses, but because of the way our law is developed, some areas of law are still viable where they aren't in other countries where they've been sort of written out either by judges or legislation. So Canada can have a relatively weaker law, though it has been, from my perspective, brought up to the international standard,
Hmm.
but its uniqueness can actually play that complementary role where other enforcers can't go.
Okay. What would be, I guess, an example of that?
Well, I'll say I'll stick with the predatory pricing because I think it's the most relevant example here. In the United States, decisions have effectively foreclosed predatory pricing as a theory of harm, as they call it in an antitrust case.
Hmm.
Predatory pricing is the concept that a competitor will run artificially low prices purely to run competition, other competitors out of the market, and then jack up prices after the fact. It's very difficult to prove, but it is really a tried and true monopolist strategy. The only time Canada's used it was in an investigation and a case between the airlines, but that was interrupted by Air Canada's bankruptcy in the early 2000s. So while U.S. enforcers believe and understand that predatory pricing is a real thing, without reform to their law, the jurisprudence doesn't allow them to take it.
Okay. I remembered there being something about airlines with that, and I never followed where it went. So it's good to know that that the bankruptcy proceeding is what happened there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I guess one of the other things, I guess, with this investigation into Google, I guess it hits a little close to home for me because I mean, the Google domination of the ad market is a lot of what happened or what went wrong with journalism and the model there. So I'm wondering, what can we hope for, I guess, that this investigation might lead to?
Well, I would hope to see a case centered on similar harms as the United States Department of Justice has brought. In their complaint, they're further along in their respective investigation that'll actually be going to trial later this year. But in their complaint, they highlight that Google's domination of advertising technology markets has allowed them to capture a greater share of advertising revenue that would have otherwise gone to publishers. They say 30% of all ad dollars going through to Google.
Hmm.
And that's a material figure. And, like a lot of things that we've been discussing over the past year in this space, that's not a silver bullet, but, a case that prevents conduct that lessens that publisher's share, I think is an important part of rebalancing the market as it figures out a new model going forward.
Okay. All right. Well, that's very good to know. Last thing I wanted to ask was you had made a comment over Twitter this last week about how Canada is moving from monopoly law to competition law. And I just wanted you to kind of expound on that a little bit more for us.
Yeah, happy to do so. So this was in response to a paper by the C.D. Howe Institute and their Canadian Competition Council. They came out against something called structural presumptions. Simply put, is tests that make it harder to get a merger through when there's a higher level of concentration. Something that we take as fairly obvious. However, is
Hmm.
not the case in Canada. And to make the case against these presumptions, the Institute pointed out how out of the 8 contested merger challenges, almost all of them, created market shares above 60%, and 4 of them created either literal monopolies or near monopolies. But our laws have only allowed for intervention in 2 of those 8 cases. They frame this as nuance and an understanding of the role of monopoly in our economy. But from my perspective, it really is an example of how we had something called the Competition Act, but really what it was facilitating the growth of monopolies as opposed to protecting competition for Canadians.
Hmm.
With the changes that the Liberals have introduced, both in C-56 and C-59, we're steering away from that and to my pithy comment, towards an actual competition law.
Well, and that's important to know as C-59 continues through the legislative process.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to explain this to us, and we'll do this again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Cheers. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.